Alright, everyone. So today I'm going to fill in something I skipped over in our introduction to grant funding, and that is methodology. So because methods are going to be different for each of you in your respective fields, this lecture will be a general overview of what methods are, why they're important, and most importantly, the function they serve in research at large and in proposals in particular. So first, a definition of methodology to start with. On a really simple level, methods are a description of how you did what you did, how you found out what you found out. For our purposes, the method section will be future tense, I will do this, but normally methods are past tense, I did this. So in grant proposals, you use future tense. In journal articles, typically you use present tense, past tense. Methods are tricky in that not all methods are equal. Methods need to fit the conventions of the discipline, meaning you wouldn't have a qualitative study on the physiological effects of soda drinking, for example. But methods also need to fit your research question. If your question is to find out the frequency of radiation rays at a given time of day, you need to consider the tools that will get you data that answers that particular question. Videographic data probably wouldn't do it, and neither would testing some biological system. There are particular technologies, particular procedures that are going to yield the answer to your question. The best way for you to find out right now what that looks like is to look at examples. Find studies in your own field that ask similar kinds of questions and study their methods. In the literature review, you may have skimmed over the design of the study in order to get to the meat and bones of the article. So here is where you might want to go back over those method sections and figure out the similarities and differences between methods. Methods are also important because they show the context in which results are interpreted. They tell a reader or a reviewer the essential assumptions of the study, the way things were when data was gathered and analyzed. So with that, the reader or reviewer can choose to understand the data with that context in mind, or can dismiss it, saying that there's too much that's unknown, unaccounted for, variable, or assumed. And then finally, a method section may visualize a process like the one shown here in figure 3 through images, figures, flowcharts, graphs, things of that nature. So what then is the purpose of a method section? In general, which for us means in academic publications, whether they be journal articles or proposals, the general purpose for a method section is to be able to validate the knowledge within the discipline. Most importantly, it's a sign to your reviewers that your methods are replicable, meaning if they go through the same procedures with the same materials, with the same populations or sites, they're going to achieve roughly the same results. This might differ in some disciplinary methods, for example, ethnographers and case studies, which are not intended to give broad sweeping results. But still, the goal is to show that this knowledge that was produced from this research design can reasonably be accepted within the scientific discourse. Now, in proposals, the goals are generally the same, but more geared towards argumentation and justification. That third question that your reviewers are going to ask of your proposal: how do we know this knowledge is valuable, valid, and true? In that sense, the proposal methods aren't as detailed as in an academic article. Their main purpose is to justify, to explain why these methods are important for this project. Methods are generally broken down into two types, though as I'll discuss in a minute, there are other ways of gathering data that don't quite fit into these two categories. Quantitative data indicates numerical representations of some kind. Usually, quantitative studies rely on observable data as opposed to experienced information. They completely remove the human from the process. Questions that are associated with quantitative studies are often along the lines of what happened or how did it happen? They are drawing conclusions about broad trends rather than deep understandings. Now, qualitative data, on the other hand, means that the research is interested in the experience of a phenomenon rather than what it actually is. Usually they rely on human accounts as data. Interviews, ethnographies, and the like are considered qualitative because they record either human experiences of something or the researcher's own subjective observations. Qualitative studies aren't interested in describing what happened typically. They are more concerned with why a thing happened, with deep understanding of a phenomenon rather than broad patterns and trends. Now, it's important to note that quantitative and qualitative are not comparatively valued. Quantitative measurements are not more or less valid than qualitative measurements. What decides validity? Remember, you know the answer to this question. We've talked about it many times this semester. Validity is about the conventions of the field. It's experts in your discipline that will determine whether something is valid, whether the production of knowledge fits the accepted models in your field. In the social sciences, qualitative data is valid. In the hard sciences, not so much. Social scientists do generally find a lot of quantitative studies conducted in their field, but not always. So remember, quantitative and qualitative data are two completely different descriptions of a reality, one concerned with what and one concerned with why. They're not better or worse, they are only appropriate or inappropriate to the given field. This is going to be important to remember as you're collaborating, as some of you come from different fields and therefore might have different opinions about what constitutes a valid method. Remember, validity depends on the conventions of the field that the research is being conducted in, so focus on that as you discuss possible avenues. As I said, there are other methods emerging specifically out of the humanities and social sciences, some geared towards media and archaeological methods. I won't go into that here, but if you're interested in methods and research designs that exist outside of this quantitative, qualitative boundary, I'm happy to chat about it one-on-one. So what does a methods section actually look like? What does it contain? As I mentioned, it's going to be important to actually read examples of this on your own, but generally, there are two components to a methods section: identification of the subject of study and description of materials and procedures. Incorporated throughout all of this will be some explanations based in the literature of why this particular method is useful for this project. As I've mentioned, grants tend to justify the choice of method more than journal articles do, so you'll want to clearly explain that. I say that this needs to be incorporated specifically because there are many ways of structuring a method section. You might begin by explaining the grounding for the method justification and then delve into your details. You might explain your details first and then justify it in hindsight, or you might incorporate your justification throughout by explaining the method in terms of its relative value and affordances in the field. Again, just be sure that you're clear on why this method for this question. In terms of content, the first step is to identify your subject. What are the objects of study? Are they things or organisms? Are they people? Are they locations? What's their deal? Tell me about them. Describe them. Tell me how many and in what context. Why these sites, people, or things. What's important about them. Now this gets to that justification aspect of the RFP method section. Next, you'll run through any materials and procedures. Be sure that you're addressing both your method for data collection, how you're going to gather or observe, and your method for analysis, how you're going to do or what you're going to do with all that data, how you're going to model, interpret, or draw conclusions from the information. Why are these procedures important? How will they garner the kinds of answers you want to get from the project? Again, that's that justification aspect of your methods. Okay, so let's talk about some examples. Admittedly, these methodologies are not in my field, so I'm probably going to fumble through them, but hopefully they'll make sense to you if this is your discipline. If not, I really do encourage you to go read the methods of the articles you looked at in your literature review, because they are going to show you exactly how knowledge gets produced and validated in your field. So first, let's run through an example in medicine. Medical fields will typically have people or patients as their subject of study. Who are they? Why are they important for this study? What is the justification for selection of these individuals? You would also want to run through any techniques or approaches to randomizing your patient group, any interventions that are necessary to know about. If you're testing a drug, what is the level of adherence? How are you measuring outcomes? What determines your sample size? What determines success? And then finally, if you're doing any kind of statistical analysis, what does that entail? Many of you are in an ecological or environmental field, so this might be a good example for you. Your subject of study is very likely going to be your location. So what's the lay of the land? What does the site look like? How can it be described so that your reader could ostensibly go back to that place and run through the same processes, paying attention to the same landforms or species? Describe species, relationships, landforms, any kind of descriptor for the place that is relevant to know. In terms of procedures, what is your experimental design? In other words, what exactly are you doing out there in the field? You might have something along the lines of plot measurements and analysis, as you kind of can see in this picture. Describe that. You might be using something like some kind of GIS technology. So what is that, and why is it important to use for this particular research question? And then finally, let's talk about the social sciences. Some of these factors might play into hard science projects as well, so consider what might be useful for you here. With the social sciences, you're typically studying sociality, the social, meaning people. So that's your subject. Who is the participant group? What are the relevant factors to know about them? How did you gather that information and why? What randomization techniques did you use? What materials, technologies, survey or observation instruments did you use and why? What variables are you considering or accounting for? What were the procedures you undertook? And then how did you analyze your data? Did you have some kind of coding schema? Did you use NVivo or some other software? Did you use grounded theory, which means you came up with your own coding scheme and were responsive to that? What is your justification for that? And how does it fit in with your question? So one thing I want to end on here is how individualized this is going to be for each group. For the most part, you all are in groups with people who are in your discipline or adjacent to your discipline. Even if you aren't, it's important to remember, again, that your discipline does determine the kinds of methods you might be able to use. A social science paper is going to have different methods than a paper looking at the activities of a specific microbe, for example. Believe it or not, knowledge is going to matter believe it or not, methods indicate a value system. The way you find knowledge is going to matter, as it will indicate your ability to validate truth within the conventions of your scientific community. In that, it won't make sense to impose your value system, your method, on a project that holds a completely different value system. This will play into how sample sizes work, how analyses work, the technologies and materials you choose to use. This is where I think a lot of students, especially in the hard sciences, get caught up. It's not necessarily that quantitative methods are always better than qualitative. These are only two different ways of describing reality, as I mentioned earlier, and your use of them will need to fit within your discipline, your specific question, and the kinds of realities your discipline values, observable or experienced. And that is it for today. This will be the last lecture of this unit, and then next week we'll be talking a little bit about conference presentations and presentation style. Thanks so much for listening.